Hello and welcome to Missouri's French Creole History and Folklore. I'm Beth Pike with the State Historical Society of Missouri. We are happy to have you join us from all over the country and Canada, including our friends in Florida who registered for today's program. We certainly hope you and your loved ones are safe from the destruction of Hurricane Milton. A few housekeeping notes before we get started. Today's program, sponsored by the State Historical Society of Missouri, is possible because of the support of our membership. We appreciate your annual support and invite you to join the State Historical Society of Missouri to support our mission and also receive our award-winning scholarly journal, the Missouri Historical Review. Also, our latest issue features the cover of our magazine, which goes to our membership, with Brian Hawkins, an animation from one of his films, which explores the folklore of Missouri's French community. So if you are a member, you will have already received that copy of the magazine. Following Brian's talk, we're going to open it up to your questions. We cannot hear or see you, but you will be able to type your questions by clicking the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and we'll answer those questions at the end of the program. I'm honored to welcome artist and filmmaker Brian Hawkins, who draws inspiration from the music, folklore, and history of his native state of Missouri. Brian's award-winning films have screened at numerous festivals, including the prestigious Annecy International Animation Festival in France. Hawkins is an adjunct lecturer in the visual arts at the University of Kansas and the University of Missouri, Kansas City, and he recently developed and taught a course on Missouri French culture at the University of Missouri, Columbia. Welcome, Brian.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure to have this opportunity. Thanks for organizing it, and thank you all for being here today. I'm working on a documentary called Toujours Icitte, and this is, the title's inspired by a sign that I saw the first time that I went to Old Mines, Missouri, in 2016. And there's an area where there's an autumn festival, and above the stage was written 300 ans, on est toujours ici. 300 years and we're still here. And that really left an impression on me because it tells, the story of a group of people who, for 3 centuries, in the middle of Missouri, in the foothills of the Ozarks, have been, maintaining an active connection with their heritage, their French heritage. And it's a community that is often overlooked, and when we talk about Missouri history, have a certain narrative that has become, sort of predominant. And having grown up in the state and learned, about the state's history, I knew that there was a French presence before the state became part of America, but I didn't have any idea that the presence continued, in any way. And so a lot of times it's sort of, this French period is treated as sort of a prehistory, much like, the thousands of years of Native Americans being on the continent. We just acknowledge that they were here, and then we introduce Lewis and Clark, and the story kind of fits into the American narrative at that point. But that raises a lot of questions if you're a curious person. What happened to the population in this area? How is it that their culture is related to or different from French culture in other parts of the world? And what was the assimilation process like? And so I started kind of digging into these questions, and so did a lot of other researchers, beginning in mostly in the 1930s is when the efforts really got going, and we see a lot of people kind of coming in and recognizing that there's this group of people that still speak Missouri French, and it's worth documenting, it's worth learning about. And so the information that they collected is really precious, and the fact that there's still a community centered around Old Mines today that identifies with this heritage, I think, is really special. And the last century has been really difficult because the French language, more or less, is not spoken in the community anymore on a daily basis. And so people have had to make a concerted effort to maintain those ties. And that's kind of what I'd like to talk a little bit about today, and just show you some of the really terrific materials that have been gathered. And a lot of the ones that I'm going to be sharing are from the State Historical Society's collection. So with that, let's dive in. The French first came into the area in the around 1673. There was an expedition with Jacques Marquette and Louis Joliet that ended up being the first time that the French, entered the Mississippi River Valley, and they were exploring the region and also meeting people who lived in the area. And so here you can see the map that they created, and a lot of very familiar Native American nation names are represented here. You can see the Osage, the Peoria, the Kaskaskia. The spelling is a little bit different from what we're used to today, but they're all showing up, and you can see that, at least the French were paying attention, and they recognized that the Illinois were very receptive to a relationship. And so the Jesuits founded a lot of missions to preach in the area, in places like Cahokia and Kaskaskia. And then a bunch of people who worked in the fur trade also came, and eventually there was a small population here that, they came to trade and proselytize and exploit the mineral resources of the region. And so what they found is that, the lands along the Mississippi River are incredibly fertile. And so what you'll see is that they set up villages where they could farm, and a lot of what they were growing were cereal crops like wheat. And this played an important role in New France and Louisiana, because down in Louisiana, the current state of Louisiana, it's very difficult to grow wheat. And so the Illinois country supplied a lot of the grain that sustained the colony further down the river. Initially, beginning in 1699, when Cahokia was founded, all of the French settlements more or less sprung up on the eastern bank of the Mississippi River. And that was primarily where they lived. And they would only really cross into present-day Missouri to go hunting or to extract certain resources. As you can see on this map, which dates to 1719, on the western side of the Mississippi, just below the Merrimack, you'll see an indication of mine. That's more or less where Old Mines is located, even though it wasn't officially founded until 1723. We consider this land grant that was given to Philippe Francois Renaud as the sort of founding date. You can see that they already knew that there was lead and other mineral resources in the area that could be exploited. And so that's reflected on this map. So there was a group of people living in the, present day state of Missouri, earlier than 1723 on a temporary basis. And eventually, over a few decades, that became a sort of a permanent settlement that was situated around a parish, the St. Joachim Catholic Church. And so what began as sort of this satellite, very rural outpost in this colony, which was known as the Illinois country, today is sort of the last bastion of the culture. So after the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, the larger French settlements in places like Kaskaskia, Cahokia, Illinois, and then in St. Genevieve and St. Louis, Missouri, they assimilated very rapidly into American culture. And that just really wasn't the case in a place like Old Mines, which was a little bit more isolated. Before I move on, I neglected to mention the fact that while the French population, mostly kind of blossomed on the eastern bank of the Mississippi River initially, following the 7 Years' War, that territory became British. And so all of the French people on that side, or the majority of them, were incentivized to move to the western bank of the Mississippi, which was at that point Spanish territory. So that's how you see places like St. Genevieve and St. Louis attracting a huge population very rapidly. They'd just been founded, not that long prior to France losing the territories in this area. And so the fact that the Mississippi River became an international boundary at that point, like I said, the French felt like they wanted to live in Spanish territory because it was under Catholic monarchy. And in many ways, the Spanish didn't really have too much of an interest in or too much of a clear idea of what to do with Louisiana. And so they took a very kind of hands-off approach. And even though it was technically Spanish territory, a lot of the administrative work was still done in French. French was still spoken. You did have people from Spain who came and were installed in positions of government. But it's just kind of an interesting way that the population is kind of moving. And it also, reflects this sort of incompatibility between the sort of Anglo-American mentality and the mentality of the French in the area. So in old mines, what you find is a group of people who have these ties to the families that were in St. Genevieve or Kaskaskia, but who didn't assimilate at the same time, and who preserved their way of life, language, and folklore well into the 20th century. And pretty soon we'll see a photograph of old mines at the turn of the 20th century when it would have been known as La Vieille Mine. And really, if you go today, very little has changed sort of from this photo. You still see Old Mines Creek running, right next to, in front of the church, St. Joachim's Catholic Church. And it's, the road has been paved, and that's Highway 21. But aside from that, very little has really changed from the time that this photograph was taken in terms of just the landscape. But culturally, there, as I mentioned, has been quite a big shift over the last 100 years. So the people in this photograph, they would have earned a living by mining lead and barite, which is a mineral that became the primary thing that they were mining in the mid-19th century. And, at this point, they would have been speaking a variety of the French language, which we now call Missouri French. And it's a variety that, is very closely related to what's spoken in Canada and the St. Laurentian Valley, where most of this population came from. But it also has, some sort of elements that are closer maybe to Louisiana varieties of French as well. Which I think makes sense when you consider the trade between these two regions. So the children in this photo, this was taken around 1914, they would have all gone to school speaking Missouri French. They had the misfortune of being the first generation that had to go to school in English and didn't have older siblings that had gone through this process to kind of help them negotiate a new language. So it was a very traumatic experience for these children in particular. And many of the children in this photograph, would go on to be informants later in the 20th century for sociolinguists and folklorists. And I don't know if you can see my cursor, but on the right-hand side, there's a boy whose face is a little scratched up in this photo, and he's wearing overalls. That's Max Vilmer. And when he was interviewed in 1977, he talked a little bit about this period of his life, and he described it as it was a hell of a mix-up. And he talked about, the prejudice that they faced from the American English-speaking population surrounding them. And he talked about, you know, going to school and not understanding really what was going on initially. And so this photograph, I think, really tells you know, an important part of the story. And you can see that nobody's having a great time at the Old Mines Public School in 1914. The compulsory education law was passed in 1905, and that meant that, you know, children between the ages of 6 and 16 had to go to school, and the lessons would be in English. And so that's, you can see the effects of that law here. And then in 1919, that seems to be the year that they started enforcing it really in Old Mines. And we have interviews with one of the one-room school teachers at this school, and she said that her class ballooned that year. She had 94 students, I think, but, you know, between the ages of 1st and 8th grade. The majority of them were in 1st grade, and the 1st graders were the ages of 6 to 16. They, because some of them had never gone to school before. I'm going to let you listen to a interview with Rosie Pratt she was a student actually at that school in 1919. So this is her describing a childhood experience that many people shared.
Quand on était petite, mon père nous envoyait au magasin, puis on ne connaissait pas comment charrer en anglais. Puis il nous disait quoi c'est dire. Puis tout le long du chemin au magasin, on disait quoi ça voulait en anglais. En tout cas, que les garçons leur étaient là-dedans, puis on n'aurait pas compris qu'on aurait voulu en français. On ne pouvait pas parler en anglais en tout quand on était petite.
Quelles sont les choses qui ont le plus changé ici?
Ça regarde comme il travaillait plus fort qu'il travaillait. Il travaillait dans les piochers. Mon père, il travaillait dans les piochers, là. Puis s'il faisait un lot de tuf par semaine, et puis il envoyait un lot de tuf, puis il avait 8 piastres là-dedans, ça. Dans ce temps-là, tu pouvais t'acheter autant de manger pour 8 piastres, comme tu peux acheter pour 16 piastres à cette heure-là. Puis c'est comme ça, nous autres, on vivait. C'était d'ouvrage dur. Puis ma soeur, là, elle aimait mieux prendre le pic, puis le chaudron, pour aller scraper du tuf qu'elle allait travailler pour Codzane. Elle dit, tu peux être ton boss toi-même, mais quand tu vas faire ça, puis que tu travailles pour Codzane, tu es boss en tout. C'est vrai, donc.
Et vous n'avez pas pioché de tuf?
Oh, moi, j'en ai pioché pas beaucoup. Je scrapais, mais pas beaucoup, moi. Oh oui, moi, puis ma tante, une fois, pauvre enfant, son mari, il était mort.
So you can see that, that these stories often are linked together. And believe me, I wish I could play more and more of that interview. But what she was describing is true. A lot of people worked in old mines, in the mines, and it was a very sort of simple process, really. They mostly were doing hand mining, while the more Americanized communities surrounding them were becoming more and more industrialized. The French continued working in this way, where they would dig a hole, and not very deep usually, about 30 feet deep, and then they would kind of tunnel along a little bit of distance before they became pretty concerned about collapse, especially when they were mining for TIFF. And so you can see the windlass that they would use, which they called a rouleau. This is going to be a clip from a man named Joe Dave Polite, who was a fiddler in the community and was interviewed in the 1970s by the Missouri Friends of the Folk Arts.
I like to drown it, fellow, you see. I sunk a hole here and I run a drift straight. And I run it 126 shovel handle long. It went this one and it turned out this one. And that hole got full of water, and I had tiff about that thick. And I was a digging with a boy, and I don't see how the hell he didn't get drowned. I told him, you sank that hole right here, so don't sink it too close. No, he did. He's liking about that much, busting the drip. So whenever I went to the store and I come back and he had a song about that deep and I got in and I sung it about that deep. I got the tip out of the hole level and went down through the tip. I run a drift this way. All from me at the television. And then I started to cut another drift there and I could hear the water glug, 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 glug. And I had a tub of tips there. And I said, get on that tub, I said, boy, because that's going to go in. When I got him up to the lining board, I said, get out of there. And he got out and I took the tub and I pulled the tub and landed the tub like that and I turned the crank loose. That boy run down. When that tub hit the lining board, I took it and I gave it a lunge like that and about that time the water busted. And it filled that hole full of water. And whenever the hole was full of water, then the drift broke and it bared it this way and throwed the windlass. And the hole here and it filled that windlass full of dirt. There was that much of dirt over the windlass.
Wow. That's quite
Well, I come down here running a board right there.
So it was very dangerous work. Here you can see the weighing station in Cadet where they would take the tip. And, you know, groups of miners. This backbreaking work, though, was really just one part of the story. I think that often we kind of focus on the hardships of these communities and the ways that I think that, you know, a community that resists assimilation for a long time sometimes can be portrayed as a community that is resistant to change or quote unquote a little bit backwards. And I don't think that that is fair. I think that that is, there are many reasons that people might choose to you know, hold on to parts of their culture. And I think that a big part of that explanation is that they find a lot of meaning and joy in their culture. And that's one thing that we see in the community in old mines today that I think remains particularly evident, is that these strong family ties and traditions of really just, there's a real joie de vivre, there's a real way of knowing how to get people together, making them feel welcome and having a good time without really spending a lot of money or too many resources. And so these are aspects of the culture that I think are really, really important to talk about. And that's going to be mostly what we focus on for the rest of the talk today. And, you know, if you go, you'll find a group of people who really enjoy music, really enjoy storytelling, and have these long traditions stretching back, you know, hundreds of years in these sorts of art forms. And what we find is that get together in old mines is often called a bouillon, which, if you're familiar with Louisiana French culture, there's the gumbo, where it's, yes, it's the name of the food that people eat, but it's also the name of the party that people have as they get together to eat some gumbo. That's the way that bouillon functions in the Illinois country. It's the name of the chicken soup broth that is made, but it's also the name of the get-together. And you often would find people playing cards, telling stories and things like that at a bouillon. And in the 1970s, when people were, you know, gathering data on the community, they would ask, okay, well, what's the recipe for a bouillon? And sort of one of the parts that I really love about this is that the first and most important ingredient in a bouillon is that the chicken has to be stolen. You have to steal the chicken, and then you have to invite the person you stole the chicken from over. They have to be a part of the party. And so there's sort of this mystery. Nobody knows whose chicken it is at first, but eventually the truth comes out. And then the person who's the target, who's been stolen from, has to say, this is the best bouillon I've ever had. This is a sort of a part of a tradition that, you know, it's using sort of mischief and, you know, creating a little bit of playful havoc in a way that is going to ensure that these continue happening. Because if you think about it, if someone steals your chicken, and then you're going to be incentivized, just to human nature is just going to incentivize you to go and steal their chicken, right? And so it's just a way of ensuring that this tradition continues and that the parties kind of there are lots of bouillons to go to. I have some good footage actually of bouillon that was thrown in the 1970s in old mines, so that they could film it. And so here you see a lot of people that we're going to be hearing from later on. In addition to this kind of storytelling, playing music, dancing and playing music, there was storytelling was a very important part of the community. And really what drew me to old mines was the folktales. And there were 73 that were published in a book by Joseph Médard Carrière in the 1930s. And that's what really caught my attention initially. And so then when I started doing research at the Center for Missouri Studies in Columbia, I went through the materials there and stumbled upon this audio cassette in the Adolph and Rebecca Schrader collection, where Pete Bouyer is telling a story that wasn't published in that collection. And it was the first time that I heard Missouri French being spoken by a fluent speaker. And the story was just incredible. I immediately recognized that it was something I wanted to work with. So this is just an excerpt from the animation that I made adapting this story.
Une fois, à longtemps passé, il vivait un homme puis il aimait à chasser. Puis son nom c'était Chasse-Galerie. Une journée, il a parti à chasser, puis il a chassé toute la grande journée. Bien tard dans l'après-midi, il a vu que s'il avait une rivière, la rivière était glacée. Il a pensé à Raymond, il dit, comment c'est m'attraper les oies là, il dit. Beaucoup, il dit, je connais, il dit, que c'est ma faire. M'allait casser la glace, puis m'a nagé sur la glace, puis m'a marré ma guide entre le pied. Ben, il a fait ça. Quand il a fait ça, il a crié à les oies, puis il dit, Heist! Les oies l'ont parti à voler dans l'air, puis l'ont volé, puis l'ont volé, puis l'ont volé par-dessus les bois. Il ne peut pas se tienne sur la guide plus longtemps. Sur la tombée, puis quand il a tombé dans un arbre creux. Quand un arbre creux, il ne peut pas sortir. Ben, sa barbe, elle a poussé à travers de l'arbre, puis elle a couru, descendant la côte, qu'il y avait une rivière.
So that was the first of many episodes of this story. And what's pretty remarkable about that portion of the story is that we also find it being told by the Peoria in the early 1900s. George Washington Finley was recorded. His version of the story was transcribed, and it's called How Wissahickon Got Into Some Trouble. Wissahickon is kind of the trickster figure in Miami, Illinois folklore. And he, there's a segment in that story where he also swims under water and ties up the waterfowl and gets carried away. And so I think this is pretty solid evidence of the fact that there was a lot of cultural interchange going on between the French and the Illinois in particular. The various nations that were a part of the Illinois Confederation today are regrouped under the Peoria tribe of Indians of Oklahoma. And so, I think that not only were they close trading partners and military allies, there was a lot of intermarriage happening, especially early on in the colony when you have a lot of single men coming from Quebec, installing themselves here, working in the fur trade. And for a number of reasons, the women of the Illinois were incentivized to marry them, not only to further, these sort of ties and alliances, but also just because of the fact that the Illinois had been at war for so long, there was a disparity in the number of men and women. So these sorts of things kind of resonate through time in ways when, if you really look at kind of, I think, the sources of these tales, you can learn quite a bit about the mix of cultures. And So we find that too with the, enslaved West African people who were in the community. Their folklore also influences the tales that were told in the Illinois country. And we have, stories of Bouki Pi Lapin. Bouki is the Wolof word for hyena, for instance. And so people didn't know what hyena was after, these stories existed in America for a while. Bouki just became a figure that was sort of mysterious, but that word survives, right? And so it gives us these clues about kind of the makeup of the community. Chasse-Galerie is a tale that's really well known in Quebec, and it's a very different tale up there. It also involves, often a hunter or a person who is, working as a logger, getting borne aloft by a canoe in order to travel great distances, but that's usually through a pact made with the devil. So you can see there are some slight similarities, but this tale that Pete told is quite different. His niece, however, I interviewed recently, and she remembered another version of the Chasse-Galerie tale.
Oh, Uncle Pete could tell some stories.
Yeah.
But then so could his father.
Is that where he learned a lot of them, you think?
Oh, well, yes. Grandpa Boyer he was full of it.
Right. Do you have any idea who Givarin is?
No, he was just a guy that was with Chasse-Galerie.
Yeah.
And they went to church.
Yeah.
They were passing the church. They were going hunting. And Givarin said he had to stop and go to church. And Chasse-Galerie said no. And he said, well, I'm going to stop and go in and say a prayer anyway. It was Sunday and they should have been going to Mass. And so he did. He stopped and he went in and he said a prayer. So whenever it was time for them to die, they got an unusual punishment. Givarin just walked around all over the world, and he always had a nickel in his pocket. He would wait and there'd be another nickel. But he always had a nickel in his pocket. And then the other one, Chasse-Galerie, he rode around in the sky on his little dog sled. And if you go out and it's very quiet, and they used to tell us this and we did it, and you could hear the bells ring on that little sled and hear him holler for them to move on faster.
Oh my goodness.
And now the one with the money in his pocket all the time, he would have to wait until he had enough money that came out to buy whatever he wanted to buy. And at one time I did see, they told me that's who it was up at Grandpa Boyer's, because he stood and he stood and he stood, and finally he came over and with his money.
And he had a whole bunch of nickels, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah. So was the idea that they were ghosts?
They never explained that. They just said that that's what they were doing.
So her Grandpa Boyer, Pete's father, had a general store in Ricola, and that ended up being a very important cultural center in the region. I'm going to let Pete Boyer talk a little bit about collecting these stories in the 1930s. He played a large role in the publication of this book by introducing Carrière to his informants.
When Carrière came here, of course, first time he came here, he didn't have any success at all. See, they didn't want to have anything to do with strangers. And so he came out there and he was speaking French. And finally one day he went down to the Ricola post office and they said, well, the only way you'll get them stories is if you go down to the store down there and get Pete to introduce you to everybody, go along with you. He says you'll probably get them. So he came in and he asked me.
Ils m'ont dit en français aussi.
Yeah, en français. See? And I said, well, I'll help you get them.
So he did. He introduced Carrière to these two men, among others, but these are the two that were featured in this book. I think a distinction here to be made between people who tell stories and people who are considered conteurs. And the conteurs were people who practiced and really honed the craft and took it very seriously. Here's another brief clip that was found
The
in.
storyteller was a special person.
Oh yeah, he is a sort of person because they looked up to him, like my grandfather, Charlie's grandfather, also Duclos, and then he had another one named Boy Bursaw, Bourassa.
Yeah, that was my neighbor.
He was real good at it, and there was more of them. There was well, everybody could tell stories, you know, but they were the best, you know. We remember those because they were the best.
Yeah, this Boy Bursaw, we used to call him Boy. Frank was his name, Frank Bursaw. And he could tell the stories just so good, you know. He put the actions in it and everything. And he was really some storyteller, you know. He was wonderful. I used to love to go down there and I'd ask him to tell a story. And I'd say, conte-moi d'un conte, mon old boy. Conte un conte. He'd say, tell a tale. He'd turn it the other way, you know.
Mm-hmm.
He'd say it in French. And of course, he didn't want to get started. But once he got started telling a story, he'd really go to telling a real good story. Sometimes they were long ones, too.
Carambeau is a long
one. Le Diable. La Diable, I don't know. He told a big, long story about the devil.
So this mention of the big long story about the devil is kind of wonderful because before finding this clip, I had decided really after reading Carrière that one of the stories that really caught my attention was Le Petit Bœuf au Cornes d'Or, the little bull with golden horns, which is a big long story about the devil told by Boy Bursaw. I've worked on an animation of that. It's 15 minutes long, and it'll be premiering at the St. Louis International Film Festival in a few weeks. Tickets go on sale, I think, in the next week or so. So here's a quick clip just showing some extracts.
That there would be getting me.
C'est bon de vous dire. Une fois, si Jean pis Grand Guillaume sont tes voisins. Mais au bout de quelques temps, il s'est mis à jongler. Le roi a dit, « Tu vas te faire tuer. » Il n'a pas de danger. Je crois que je vais aller veiller à soir.
So these stories, they not only, you know, tell us about the sort of historical roots of where the population came from and what communities were in contact with one another. They also are a great repository for Missouri French because when linguists were coming into this community, you can have a conversation about anything that you want, but if somebody's telling a story, that's going to unlock a certain, you know, remembered set of phrases. People telling stories use language in a more interesting way often than they would if they were just talking about the weather. And so these stories show us a lot about the sort of linguistic reality of Missouri French, which we no longer really have a lot of access to. And they also show us how these narratives evolved to reflect the mentality of the people who were living in this community. What choices did people make as they told these stories? How did they join different episodes together? And what happened to them, you know, in Missouri that maybe didn't happen in France or in Canada or in Louisiana or elsewhere? And so one element that really just sort of defines Missouri French folklore and is kind of wonderful is just a complete lack often of any discernible morality. Characters often are introduced and they seem like, you know, the representation of a good protagonist, and then they become corrupted and evil through the story. Or, you know, things are just very in some ways true to life, you know, and I think that it also shows that there's, I think, a real sort of acceptance of sort of the darker parts of the human psyche that that really permeates this group of oral literature, and is pretty wonderful. When Carrière came, he also collected songs, and this is the Edison Ambarola wax cylinder machine that he brought with him. It's been returned to the Old Mines Area Historical Society after having been sort of neglected for several decades. The wax cylinders that Carrière recorded in Missouri, he tried to donate to his alma mater and then I think he also, well, at Laval, they have a few, which were just recently transferred, but the majority of them were rejected and ended up in Carrière's attic. And really upon his death, that's when they were donated to Lafayette. And there was a long period in the 1970s where people were trying to track down the cylinders. They eventually were transferred by the Library of Congress as a part of the Federal Cylinder Project. And because there were people in Old Mines who were living relatives of the performers, and there was, you know, thanks to the work of people like Rosemary Hyde Thomas and Natalie Vilmer, a petition was signed by, I want to say it was over 300 people signed this petition to get them expedited, and it worked. They moved them to the top of the list, and that allowed people who, you know, were children of performers to listen to these recordings that had been made in the 1930s and try to identify voices and songs. And then around 2002, they were eventually brought back to Old Mines, as you can see here in this little article that was published. This is one of the songs that was recorded, and this is an interview with the daughter of the performer that Ray Brasser conducted.
How's the verse go? Is it, you remember the words? And
C'est la belle Blandine, puis faire une autre chanson. Quand la chanson commence, son père l'a tué. Son père l'a tué. It repeats a lot, you know. Après, puis à la porte, dans la cave à terre. Quand on a fermé la porte, le bourreau est rentré.
Some of the lyrics that I transcribed there are not what she said, but they're related to her father's rendition, which I think is closer to the song. And an interesting thing to point out is just Boro is normally hangman, but it was defined by Annie Paggi and I think a few other people as sheriff. So I've just used that as a translation for Boro.
La pluie passe sa main blanche, ballon et lona. La pluie passe sa main blanche, derrière lui a monté. Derrière lui a monté, derrière lui a monté. Quand l'on fut sur les coteaux, Malo et lona. Quand l'on fut sur les coteaux, persuade de ce potos. Persuade de ce potos, persuade de ce potos. On dit moi beau prince, Malo et lona. On dit moi beau prince, pour qui ces poteaux-là? Pour qui ces poteaux-là? Pour qui ces poteaux-là? Fille qu'a tué son père, Malo et Lona. Fille qu'a tué son père, pour il c'est potola. Pour il c'est potola, pour il c'est potola. Au-delà de garde d'un œil de piquet. D'un œil de piquet, d'un œil de piquet. Oh, dites-moi, Blandine, Malo et Lona. Oh, dites-moi, Blandine, vous voulez m'épouser. Vous voulez m'épouser, vous voulez m'épouser. Non, livrez-moi, beau prince, Malo et Lona. Non, livrez-moi, beau prince, j'attimerai mieux vos rires.
She was pretty rough,
Yeah.
that girl. She wouldn't marry him.
No, she'd rather die than
Not if
because
she,
it
not if he's going to
betrayed
build
her. Betrayed
gallant.
her.
What occasions would your dad sing a song like that?
Well, you see, in the evening we had no television, no radios, of course, in those days, and he played a fiddle. And he'd, when a guitar played the fiddle, well, he'd sing, and I learned that song from him.
You've been playing fiddle for many, many years. When did you first start to play the fiddle?
Well,
You
I
talked
used to get on the bed, stand on the bed, and pick up my dad's fiddle. He had a small fiddle, which was only 3/4 size. I used to stand on the bed because that's where he stood. He hung the fiddle on a nail, and I'd have to get on the bed to reach the fiddle. So I'd just get the fiddle off of that nail and the bow, and then I'd stand on the bed and start playing. And they said I played pretty good for a 5-year-old.
When you played fiddle, did you play for dances or entertainments like that? Or
Well, as soon as I got old enough, I started playing for parties. And
about how old were you then when you were starting to
I
play?
was about 12 years old. I used to stand on a chair so they could hear me. And then after I got started playing like that, well, later on, of course, it was a long time before we ever got electric. You know, electric didn't get on the fiddle for a long, many years. But we used to really play hard, make them sound.
So Charlie Paggi was an important informant for the Missouri Friends of the Folk Arts, which was a group that was started in the 1970s in St. Louis. They were university students who just were passionate about folk music and realized that a lot of the cultural bearers were going to pass away soon. So they mobilized to start recording people around the Ozarks. They made this LP, a double LP of Missouri fiddling mostly. But there's some singing and other folk music on this, and some great storytelling as well. Side D is all stuff from Old Mines, Missouri. And they also started putting together festivals, and this was at Washington University in St. Louis, and in 1976, I think. And what you see are the Balfa brothers from Louisiana, sitting next to Joe Coley from Old Mines. There was this initiative to reunite French-speaking America around the Mississippi River Valley and get people together for a good time. It just happened that there was a psycho-sociolinguist in the audience, Rosemary Hyde Thomas, who felt like this was just really incredible. She was teaching French in St. Louis and still working on her dissertation, and she took a tour to Old Mines where Natalie Vilmer introduced, the concept of the community, and also talked about how it was a shame that people in their 30s and 40s at that point didn't speak French. Their parents didn't pass on the language to them. And she said it's a shame, that all of our relatives are going to pass away and the language will go with them. And so that was what really got Rosemary Hyde Thomas fired up to volunteer to come and get these elderly people together and record over 200 hours worth of interviews with people in the community, individually and in groups. And so here you can see some rare footage from that project. These traditions have continued to evolve. In an interview that I did with Anna Pratt here, I asked if she knew any songs, and she said, "Mais pistolet à terre." What is that? Well, you've never heard Pistol Packin' Mama? That's Pistol Packin' Mama in French. We used to sing that all the time. And so you can see that, these are living sorts of traditions. People are adapting to the world around them. And, part of that process, losing the French language, with that generation, that did end up happening. There weren't a lot of people who were able to get to a reasonable level of fluency. And if you don't have a large community, it's hard to maintain fluency. And so that ended up kind of forcing people then to have to be creative and find new cultural expressions. And Anna played an important role in that by, starting with some of these local gatherings, the Rendezvous, which is kind of a living history festival. She started baking bread in these traditional ovens. And so this is a picture of her family that kind of continues this tradition. It's just kind of wonderful to see that people are making the best out of a suboptimal situation, and that people still feel connected to these roots in spite of this assimilation process. So I think now if we can go to the questions, that would be fine.
John asked, do you have a recipe for chicken bouillon? And he won't, however, still ate chicken in the process.
Well, you've got to steal a chicken, and then you've got to, but basically you just boil it. You put the whole chicken in, bones and all, and boil it. And people have different approaches, but I don't think you add your vegetables because they'll get too soft. So you just make the broth, and then you can take the meat out, debone it, chop it up a little bit. And some people will put, celery and onions and carrots in at that point, just for some extra flavor. But often the bouillon, the broth, was served in cups, and then people would kind of help themselves to some of the meat. And then they would eat them kind of separately, like they would drink the broth, eat some of the meat, and then there would often be pickles that accompanied that, or just other things that people would bring. So it's a very simple meal, but it's really good. And then they would use often crackers, like just saltine crackers, to thicken the broth too. That's another.
And my German grandmother taught me that too. Same broth that you use for chicken noodle soup. So I boil the chicken to get the broth going. So that's great. So Robert, his family came into Quebec City in about 1666. He lives in Ottawa, and he wants to know what took them to St. Genevieve after the British conquest of Canada.
Well, like I said, they didn't really enjoy the idea of living in British territory. And so if people were already in the Illinois country, for instance, in Kaskaskia on the Illinois side, they were incentivized to go to the Spanish territory. A really good book about this is French Roots in the Illinois Country by Carl Eckberg, which talks a lot about these different mentalities and how the French life was centered around the church, and it was centered around community. And the French were settling in these villages where they were very closely knit, and they had an interesting system that developed in the Illinois country where everybody would have a strip of land, depending on how much wealth they had more or less, but there was river frontage. And so there were these long, narrow strips, and they fenced off this large arable field. And if you go to St. Genevieve, you can still see it. It's still there. But they didn't fence off their individual sections. All of those were left open. So it was basically everybody's plowlands just flowed right into their neighbors' plowlands. And they built a fence around this entire area. And there were a lot of initial laws at this period that really were focused on making sure that people maintained their portion of the fence. It was very important to keep the foraging animals out. They just kind of left their livestock free. And so this was how they would grow their wheat. They would all plow together. It was very efficient. Throw the wheat in, make sure that they kept the animals out as it was growing. After harvest, then they would let the animals in actually to graze on the stubble and fertilize the field. And so the whole, and that at that point, it's just common land. Like nobody has any claim over one portion or another. And so it's a very different way, really, of thinking about farming compared to the American approach, where you and your little nuclear family go out and you have your farmhouse and your land and nobody else is allowed. And so, yeah, it was a very different way. It ended up kind of generating a lot of conflict. And for people in Quebec, I think one thing that happened is if you were like a younger son in the family and you weren't going to inherit any land, it was difficult then for you. And so a lot of times these younger men would kind of go out to stake a claim elsewhere, right? And kind of have a piece of property, and it was available in the Illinois country. And so it attracted a certain type of person, I guess, that would maybe want to move from Quebec to the Illinois country because it was very remote. So that kind of, maybe there was also a certain amount of freedom from social expectations and things like that that existed in the Illinois country that attracted a certain kind of person as well. But those are some of the reasons, I guess, that people might have moved here and might have shifted from one side of the river to the other.
Sure. Laura asked a good question. What exactly is TIFF?
TIFF is barite, and I should have had the forethought to bring some into this room, but it's just sort of a chalky, very, very heavy mineral that you find that grows with forms along with lead. So they initially came, to mine lead, and then once that was more or less kind of being exhausted in the area, fortune just sort of would have it that the uses were found for barite, which is what they call Tuus. And then in English, it's TIFF. So that it's used to make barium. Like if you go, for medical imaging and you have to drink barium, it's also used in oil drilling, and there are lots of different industrial uses for it.
We're going to get through some more questions here. I do want to let our participants know that in the chat function, I have listed Brian's contact information. So if you later think of a question and want to follow up with him or see more of his work, go over to that chat section just to the left of the Q&A, and you will see his information. So you'll have some time to write that down before we do in this program. But I'm going to move on to John's question about how many people lived at old mines around 1900.
I'm not sure around 1900. Around 1930, whenever Cavalier came in, there were about 600 French-speaking families in the region. I just know that number off the top of my head, but I'm not sure from a sort of like population standpoint exactly what the numbers are in 1900.
Sure. Don asked, did enslaved Africans speak or have an influence on Missouri French language or on old mines culture?
Yeah, they did speak French, and it's possible that they spoke a variety of languages, West African languages when they came, which is why we have words like Buki that show up. I think the fact that those stories exist and that people still know stories about Buki, I spoke to someone a couple of years ago who told me a story about Coco Tree, and he didn't know what Coco Tree was. It was just a character. That's a crocodile. So again, we have evidence of people, who probably spoke, maybe who maybe spent some time in Louisiana before coming into the region. Or it could be that, a lot of the people who were enslaved worked on the rivers too. That was really backbreaking work, getting goods up from New Orleans to the Illinois country was exhausting and just like took a lot of manpower. So a lot of times people who were enslaved were used in that capacity as well, and would have spent probably quite a bit of time between the upper Louisiana and lower Louisiana. So hopefully that answers your question.
Are there any French speakers today in this area?
Yeah, there are some people who speak French, and there aren't that many, but there are a few.
And I noticed you recently went back to the area for, was it kind of a reunion of sorts or festival? Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I went for the St. Joachim picnic, which is called the Fall Festival. And that's a wonderful sort of parish picnic where you can get, chicken dinner and play games and talk to people. But probably if you aren't from the community or don't know anyone, I would recommend going to the Fête de l'Automne, which just happened. It's always the first Sunday in October in Fertile, Missouri, which is a little bit north of Old Mines, but a part of the Old Mines area. And Dennis Stromat plays tunes that he learned from people like Charlie Paggi, who you saw, and it's a really good time. I would recommend going to that probably, or to the rendezvous, which happens in the spring. There's one in I think February, and then one in April or May, and that's where the family of Anna Pratt, you'll find them baking bread there, and that's in Old Mines proper too.
And that's some information you can get to them if they email you about dates
Yeah.
next year, who they would contact if they want to come into the area for it. Matt says that he grew up in Missouri and he wondered if any Missouri French has gotten into English in Missouri or slang. Can you point to examples in our language that originated in Missouri French?
I don't think so. I think that some of the pronunciation of French words in like St. Louis street names, for instance, Gravois, is sort of a unexpected way to pronounce that word. Maybe if you've taken French in high school or college, you might pronounce it Gravois. But that is linked to this vowel shift that hadn't happened in France when the people who populated this area had left. So a lot of words that end in OIS, like Illinois, for instance, they would have pronounced it Illinois. And so that, I guess, has sort of influenced our everyday speech more, I guess, if you're from the area. But I don't think there are any expressions or anything like that.
Sure. Well, Aaron Smith is the new tourism director for St. Genevieve, and he's wondering if you'd be interested in showing some of your short animations at their welcome center or collaborate a way to contextualize it for people. So I might just mention, Aaron, go ahead and get in touch with Brian directly, right? With the email.
Yeah, that would be great.
Have in the chat function. So if you just go over to the chat function, you'll see it there. Larry says, ask, are there any current community connections between Old Mines and the other French diaspora? And he said, I saw the past connection between there and the University of Louisiana at Lafayette.
Yeah, there are. One of my friends, Kent Bone, from Old Mines, is in Lafayette, I think, today, or he's on his way for the festival. I think it's Festival International, or Festival Arcadia. And so he and a few other people, are very enthusiastic. If an opportunity arises to go to Louisiana, they'll go. And there are a number of people who have spent time from speaking Canada or Louisiana, but it's sort of individuals. I wouldn't say that it's a community, like a real community sort of connection at this point. I think it's more people who feel very rooted and connected and want to kind of seek that out elsewhere. They do, that's been my experience. There could be something that I'm unaware of.
One of our attendees wants to know what happened to the African slaves that lived in Old Mines. Are there any there now? any descendants?
That's kind of a mystery. I think that it seems like the majority of them left following emancipation. We have some oral history interviews where people remembered Black families that spoke French in the area. There was a Lamarck family that was still living in old mines around the turn of the 20th century and speaking French. And I think they lived there until they passed away. I don't think that they left. Others moved to Potosi, which is the neighboring town to the south where there were more opportunities, economically speaking. And then a lot of them moved to St. Louis. There were people in St. Genevieve also who were Black Creole, French-speaking people that that stayed in. There was a race riot that drove everybody out of St. Genevieve. Some of them returned, but very few. So it was a time when there was a lot of racial tension, and if people felt uncomfortable, they often left and tried to go somewhere where they, had more economic opportunities and fewer instances, I think, of prejudice. And so it's unfortunate that the scholarship that came into the region came in the 1930s, which was just after a lot of the Black Creole population had, I think, migrated elsewhere. And so it's difficult now. We don't really know their side of the story too well. We do have a few interviews with people like Felix Pascal and Prairie de Rocher, Illinois. He was a musician who was Black and who played a big role in making sure that La Guillonnée continued in that community, which we didn't have time to talk about. But yeah, so there is a presence and it was important, but we are still working on kind of figuring out what we can.
Is there any French language taught today in schools down here?
In DeSoto, I think there are French classes, which is a town just north of Old Mines. It's been an issue. I think that French has been taught over the years in Old Mines, depending on enrollment and the budget and a number of things. Often for people who are maybe in their 50s, 60s, 70s today, if they took French in high school, they found that it was not useful at all for them to communicate with their older relatives. And in many instances, I think a point was made in the classes that we're here to learn real French, quote unquote, real French. And so it's unfortunate because it didn't actually help people connect, which is really the point of learning a language. And today you find people who maybe are really excited about learning French, but it's not taught in the schools. So that's unfortunate.
For people who work in historic interpretation of the Missouri French culture and language, do you recommend any particular sources or training for them?
If they wanted to speak Missouri French or what?
Yes, Missouri French. Like if they work in historic interpretation of this culture and language.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the best thing is to listen to native speakers, which we have. We have some recordings, as you saw, at the State Historical Society, which are accessible. There's also a great documentary called C'est plus comme ça anymore that was shot in Old Mines in 1977. And that was made by André Gladue and Michel Bro, and that is available on Vimeo. You can purchase it for a few dollars, and it's been newly subtitled in English. So that's a really great resource. Those are really, really helpful because as wonderful as Carriere's book is, it's been transcribed phonetically. And so you can use this and you can read this and get an idea of what the pronunciation would have been, but it doesn't tell you about the rhythm or anything. It's just very dry. So I would use a combination of listening to native speakers and then looking for a PDF of Tales from the French Folklore of Missouri, which is available online for free by Joseph Médard Carrière. And with those two things, and if you have at least an intermediate level of French, just standard French, you can get on the right path, I think.
Sure. Mark asked, are you familiar with the bell that was in St. Mary's, and is it the only town in Illinois west of the Mississippi?
I'm not sure about that.
Okay. Debbie does ask or mentions that your animations are beautiful. I think we can all agree on that. She wants to know where will they be shown and distributed?
Chasse-Galerie, which is inspired by the clip from State Historical Society, is streaming online. And so you can, if you live in anywhere but Canada, you can access it on Vimeo. And then if you live in Canada, it's on a streaming platform called arts.film. And so you can check it out there too. And it's for the new one, Les Voisins is what I titled it, and that's going to be shown at the St. Louis International Film Festival. I think it's November 10th at 1 p.m. So those tickets will go on sale, I think, at least by next week. They were trying to get the site up. So
Well, I invite anybody who can get to the St. Louis International Film Festival to check it out. It's a wonderful festival, and you can see films from all over the world. And kudos to you to be selected for that screening for the festival, because it's a wonderful festival. So that's terrific. Future plans too for like a lengthier program that you might be doing with your shorts. Where are you at with the work on it? Are you going to keep it in the short format, or are you looking at maybe extending it?
Well, I'm looking at extending it. The idea for Toujours Icitte is to combine these animated sections with the video interviews that I've been doing, and to really kind of do more or less, I guess, what this presentation has done, which is, put these things in context. But funding is always an issue. If you want to donate to that project or contribute in some way, you can do so through the Center for Independent Documentary, and their contact information is in the chat. That would be wonderful. That, it just, when you have this much material and you're trying to tell a concise story, editing becomes quite laborious. And so I imagine it'll take probably about a year of full-time work to really get something that does this story justice. Right now, I did just receive a new grant from the Charlotte Street Foundation and Spencer Museum of Art for another short, which is called "It's a Hell of a Mix-Up," and it's inspired by that interview with Max Filmer that I mentioned. And we'll see. That's kind of the near-term project. I'm focusing on that right now, and it's going to tell these nonfiction stories, that we have recorded from the community in an engaging way. So I've been focused more on the folklore for the last few years, but now I'm kind of moving into oral history mode, and it's really exciting, I think, to think about using animation as a way of telling stories that wouldn't necessarily fit into a documentary in any other format. I think that it's really difficult sometimes to convey the specialness of the community in old mines, where we have these interviews of people talking about jokes that they would play on one another, or kind of eccentric characters, or things that happened to them as a kid that don't really fit into a sort of standard documentary format. It would seem sort of irrelevant, but those little details give us so much information about what daily life is like for people and what the actual sort of lived experience was, and it's in their own words. And so I think part of my job really is to find a way of kind of getting those parts of the story out there in a way that's engaging and makes sense, So I'm excited about that project.
Well, I'm so glad you chose animation to tell these stories. It's just beautiful, and your artwork is phenomenal. So thank you so much again for sharing your time with us and exploring this fascinating topic. We'll just have to have you back another time here for some more updates, Brian. You're full of information when it comes to this. Anyway, thank you all for joining us, and we invite you to check out our SHS videos on demand for this and other programming. Thank you all for being here, and have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.